Okay guys, so in this video we are going to have a look at, well, updating a translation. So let's get into it. So if we go over to our application here, we can see here that I have this little translation that I've added. And basically I can click it and then I can say foobar and I can add some exclamation marks and then I can add a key or remove a key or something like that, and I click save, and then you can see that it actually updates the existing translation. And if I refresh, yeah, we still have the same thing. I can still of course go here and add new ones if I wanted to, and that's still going to work as previously, and I can remove them if I wanted to as well. So that is pretty much our feature right there. So let's have a look at the code. So first and foremost, I made a little change here where now I felt that, alright, the key editor component doesn't just take in whether or not it should be shown, it's actually going to use other functions as well, so I might as well just use the context directly from within the component. So I changed that. And I also added a onEdit translation function to my context that is going to take in a translation ID. And I also added an optional translation to edit, because since it's the same component we use for editing and for creating something, I mean, when I open a fresh one, I want this to be completely, it should be a fresh state. And so that means that sometimes it's going to be an edit key editor, or like the form is going to have editable content, and sometimes it's going to have fresh content. So basically I'm just storing an optional there to figure out which one it's going to be. And then I added it to my interfaces. I rebound my function here, and then I added it to my context value, and then I added this function here. onEdit translation is going to take in the ID, and then it's just going to go to my state here, and then it's going to run a find, and it's going to find the translation that has the matching translation ID, and that's going to return an optional translation, or like it might be a translation, it might not be, and then I'm just going to set that to my state, and then I'm going to set my show editor, show key editor to true, and that basically is going to show the editor with well, and that state is now been set. And onOpen is now going to set translation to edit to undefined, because when we actually just open the key editor and we want to create something, we don't want the translation to edit. So if there's a previous state, like a translation that is already held in the state, we need to clear that so it's not being shown, or that it's not being used from the key editor. And I added a little bit of an interface for my form here with just some basic types. And here is my key editor, and basically it's just going to have a state, like this component state is just going to be a form with these keys as we saw earlier. And I created an initial form which is just going to be like the key values like in their empty state, and then I added in the properties and the component state to my component. And then we have our initial form state like this, and yeah, I added an onChange. And then we did this thing here where component will receive props, and this function or this method will be invoked every time this component is actually going to receive new properties, and these are just going to be the context properties. So I'm going to check if there is a translation to edit. I'm going to extract out the translation. I'm going to do a find again, and I'm going to find the language or the translation that has the language of English, because the default behavior when I'm editing something, it's going to use the base language, which is going to be English in this case. So I just want to find the translation text that has English, and if I find that, I'm going to update my state, and I'm just going to set the form to, I'm just going to basically extract out the values of the translation that I want to edit and put that into my form state and set the state. That's about it really. And then down here, if I don't find a component to our translation to edit, I'm just going to set it to the init form. Like the form is just going to be reset to its original state. And as you can see here, instead of just looking for the thing that, like the property show, which I passed in, I'm now actually going to check the actual value that's coming from the context. And then I'm in my form fields here, I pass in my form and an onChange handler. And my onChange handler is simply going to take in a key, which is going to be a key of the editor, the key editor form. And then it's going to be a value that is either going to be a string or a string array, depending on if it's a, if it's the tags, it's going to be a string array. If it's any other value, it's just going to be a string. And then basically all I do is that I spread my state and I add the key and the value to my state and I set it again. That's well, that's pretty much it. This way I don't have to declare from here which key it is. I can simply just add whatever I want into it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And then now I extract out I changed the state so that's now actually, previously we were grabbing all of these values from the form directly, as you can see here, but now we are actually holding the form state on the state, like the React state, instead of inside the form. And so now I'm simply going to destructure out those values, and yeah, I can check here if it's an edit. Basically, if I have a translation to edit, I know that I want to edit a existing translation, and otherwise I want to save it. So if I want to edit it, I'm simply going to grab the ID of this translation, and then I'm going to run through the translation text, and I'm once again just going to find the one, like the English version of this. And if I don't find a translation text for some reason with English, I'm simply going to throw an error and not deal with that, because there should be no situation where there is no English translation. It should be like whenever there is a translation, there should be a matching English translation text, because that's the default language. And then I run my update translations method, which is just going to do a network call with my new information and update the existing translation. If we look at our key editor form fields, which are the fields themselves, we can see here that we have an interface, or a props interface, which is just going to take the form and an on-change handler, which has the same signature as you saw before in the above component. And here we declare our on key change, on description change, on translation change, these little handlers here for our different lifecycle, our different events. And for our key, we simply add in the key and then the on change. And for on change on our text area here, we're just going to use the on translation change handler instead. So basically I used a different name for this one because this one is a little bit more specific. We'll see that in just a moment. And yeah, that's pretty much the same thing for this text area here. So on translation change, I could probably change that to something better, but hey, that's the way it is. So on key change, we basically just take in, they're basically the same if we look at them. I mean, all they're going to do is they're going to take in an event. And the reason why I needed to make a distinction between on description change, on translation change, and on key change is partly because I wanted to use each key. Like I want to explicitly say which key I want to set in my on change handler, because remember, these keys need to be one of the keys that is found on my form here. But the thing is that the difference here is that these two are text areas and this is an input, and they have a slightly different interface. As you can see here, that on key change is just going to grab an HTML input element, while these two actually are HTML text area element. And that means that the way that I index into those and grab those values, the types themselves are a little bit different. So here I just go event target value, and that's good enough. But here I need to do a little bit of typecasting to extract the value. And that's pretty much the reason why I made a separation between these functions. So the tag field is also seen a few small changes. So there's an on change handler here now, same signature as before. And all I've really done here is that whenever we update our tags, I will simply call the on change with the tags key, and the value is going to be the array of tags that have been updated. And if I remove a tag, I will do the same thing. So adding and removing will update the form state, or the state that is holding our form. And then I have an onEdit function here that I've added to my translation meta bar. And basically all that's going to do is that when we actually click that little key here to the side, well, I need to add another one now. So let's do that quickly, like this. So when we click this little button here, this is actually going to call the onEdit. And onEdit, all that's going to do is that it's going to call the context function onEdit translations with the translation ID of this row, because remember, each of these meta bars is just one row in our little list here, so it will know which translation we're actually going to edit, and that's the way we, as we saw earlier, are able to figure out which of all the translations we want to grab the data that is going to be edited from. our translation value list, so I had a subtle little bug that was a little bit flaky, and you may have noticed it before. So basically, we didn't filter, or we didn't sort our list of values. Basically, we just assumed that because we were creating the English version of the language, or the English translation value first, and then the Swedish one, they would always come in sequence. But sometimes there's a bit of a delay when we actually persist things to the database. So I actually just added a little bit of sorting here, where we're simply checking whether or not the language is English, and if it is English, we're simply going to sort that higher than any other language. And since we only support 2 languages at this point, this is going to be good enough. And then we simply add a small sort function there. And yeah, well, some small arbitrary change to our CSS. And then we have added an update translation method here, which is very similar to creating a translation, with one of the differences is that the translation is no longer a string, it's actually a translation text, because when we want to update a specific translation, we can't just send a string, because that way we don't actually know which of the translations we wanted to change. I mean, if I make a change to the English version of the translation, or the translation value in the English version, how does the server know that I want to update just the English translation and not the Swedish or whatever language apart from these that we're going to support in the future? So we actually want to send the translation text as an entire entity. And then we simply, we make a request to have translations with the translation ID, and that's just going to be a put request with the body, and then we will get back a new translation, or well, the translation that we updated. And that's about it, really. And the translation text, I made a slight update here. I saw that I needed to, because I'm using an enumeration, I could probably do this nicer, but I didn't want to go through the hassle of all of this. So basically what I did was just to change change back the language to capitalized versions of themselves. And I think that's good enough for now. It's me just being a little bit lazy. I could solve this in a nicer way, but since the server is going to expect the incoming value from the client to be all caps, because the server has an enumeration of our languages in all caps, then the server is going to complain if it's just like this. So we needed to keep it this way. There are nicer, I could do this in a nicer way, but I am a very lazy person. I'm sorry about that. So apart from that, we've added a new model, which is going to be called incoming translation update. And basically the only difference between pretty much the only difference between this and an incoming translation is that this one actually has a translated text type. So instead of, like in an incoming translation, we have a string value that represents the translation, because that is the first translation we are making. So we can just add it wrap it into our model. But now we actually have an existing translation text that we want to update. So we need to actually have a type for that to enforce that it's going to be a specific translated text. And apart from that, it's pretty much the same thing. We can set a translation and all that good stuff, and some small updates to the string method here. And in our translated text, all we've added is that we've changed this model now so that it has a setter as well. So we can actually set a value called translated text, because now we actually need to make updates to our model. We don't just need to read from them or create them from scratch. And then in our translation, we've added some new logic. So I've just extracted out all of this stuff into some helper functions that made this a little bit cleaner. And then we have this thing here, set translation key, which is going to take in a key, validate that key, and then set it to the translation key. That's about it. Setting we have a setter for all the translations. I just added a setter. I don't think I actually need it right now, but hey, it's there. Setting the description, though, that's something that we need so that we can actually set the description. Setting the tags, just setting them, is also, I think, we're not going to do this. I might remove that in the future, but hey, it's just auto-generated code anyway. So update tags is a little bit different. So because when we are actually making an update, we don't just want to remove all our tags. What we want is to technically that is what we want, but we want to maintain the reference between the list that we created, because of the way that Hibernate works, we actually need to maintain the reference. I can't just overwrite the existing list because that's going to mess up my tables in my database. So what I do is basically that I clear all the tags, because like we just want to set them to whatever new tags we have sent. We're not actually going to check whether or not they have an ID or something like that, because that doesn't really make any sense. It's just a bunch of tags like text values. And then we loop through these tags, and then we simply add each one of them again. And it's very similar to creating a tag, like as we've seen before. This is pretty much the same logic, with the differences that when we call this, it's from scratch, and then we actually set the tags about the field variable to the list of tags. But in this scenario, all we're going to do is that we're going to update the existing one, because in the first case we don't have a list in the table, or we don't have a table with our tags. But in the second case, when we're updating, we actually do. So it's a good idea to just update them instead. And updating a translation is going to take a translation text, and then we're simply going to create a stream through our translations, and we're going to filter each tag or each translation, and we're going to find the tag or the translation that has an ID that matches the incoming text ID. And we're going to grab the first one of the result, which may or may not exist. So we're going to get an optional back, and then we're going to just check if it's not there. If it's not there, we were simply going to throw an illegal argument exception and say that, hey, you are trying to update a translation text that doesn't exist, and otherwise we are simply going to extract the value, and then we're going to set the text of that translation. That's pretty much it. And yeah, well, create translation is just me moving all of the translation stuff that we had in the constructor to this little helper method. So it's pretty much the same thing. We create a list, we validate that our translation is a valid string, and then we add in our translation, and then we add a Swedish empty translation text, and then we set our list, and that's pretty much it. So let's see here, let's look at the translation service as well. So I've just added a small function here to get the translation when it's going to which is going to return an optional of the translation. So it's just going to take in a translation ID, and it's just going to try to do a find by ID on that. So it's going to extract or go to the database and give us, maybe depending on if it finds it or not, a translation that matches that ID. And a few small name updates here. So translation or service is now translation service, and yeah, that's pretty much it there. And then for our update or our update method here, you can see that we have pretty much the same structure to this URL as for creating something, but we're using the put mapping instead. And the incoming translation is not an incoming translation like here, it's an incoming translation update, which is going to be very, like as you saw earlier, it's just it's almost the same thing with just a change to the translation text. And then we are going to go to the translation service, and we're going to grab our translation. And if we find one, we are going to do stuff. If we don't find it, we're going to throw an illegal argument exception and say that it wasn't found. We couldn't find a translation associated with it. And in the case that we do find it, we're just going to grab the value from the optional, and then we're going to set the description. And we're going to set the translation key, and we are going to update the tags and update the translation. And finally, we're just going to return, we're just going to save it again. And that's going to take care of the update for us, because it already has a valid ID within the database. So just saving it again is going to be the same thing as updating it in this scenario. And yeah, that is pretty much our entire feature right there. So we are going to call this pretty much done now. Let's move that over here. And in the next video, we are going to support updating a translation's value. So that's coming up next.